Hey, if you're like most people who are thinking about upgrading their car audio, you've probably got that nagging feeling that you might end up spending a lot of money on a subwoofer that sounds great on paper but ends up being a dud in the real world. You want to hear those deep, chest-rattling lows without blowing the rest of the system, and you also don't want to end up with a box that takes forever to tune or, worse, burns out the amp because it draws more power than you expected. That hesitation is exactly why I'm doing this deep dive. I've spent the last few days looking at the Sundown Audio SA15 V.3 D2, reading through the specs, comparing what other enthusiasts say about similar 15-inch drivers, and thinking through how it would actually sit in a typical daily driver versus a dedicated show car. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, let's talk about what makes a subwoofer like this one a real contender. The SA15 V.3 D2 is a 15-inch, High Excursion driver rated at 1500 watts RMS and 3000 watts peak. Those numbers are eye-catching, but they only become meaningful when you pair the sub with an enclosure that matches its needs and an amp that can actually deliver that power. Sundown ships this as a two-piece package, the sub itself plus a 2-ohm dual voice coil configuration. The dual coil gives you flexibility. You can wire it for a lower impedance if you have a beefy amp, or you can run it in series for a higher load if you're sharing the power across a multi-sub system. Now, who should consider this sub? If you have a vehicle that already sports a fairly robust audio foundation, say a 500-watt or larger amplifier, a decent head unit with pre-outs, and enough space for a proper sealed or ported enclosure, the SA15 can be a serious upgrade. It shines in trucks, SUVs, or even large sedans where the cabin volume is enough to let those low frequencies develop without sounding boomy or muddy. Because the driver is built for high excursion, it can move a lot of air, which translates into that deep feel you want when a bass line hits. In practical terms, you'll notice a real difference when you blast a song like Uptown Funk or a low PMPM hip-hop track. The floor of your vehicle will vibrate in a way that you feel rather than just hear. On the other hand, if you're running a modest 200 to 300 watt amp or you have limited space, maybe you've got a compact hatchback or you're trying to fit a sub in a small trunk, the SA15 might be overkill. The driver's power handling is hefty, and feeding it with an underpowered amp could lead to distortion, especially on fast transients. You'll also need a well-designed enclosure. Sundown's own fourth order, bandpass, enclosure specs are fairly involved, meaning you can't just drop the sub into a random box and expect stellar results. The hidden trade-off here is that the setup demands a fair amount of planning and, potentially, additional expense for the right box. Let's break down the practical strengths. The first thing I noticed when looking at the SA15's measurements is the impressive low-frequency response. The driver can comfortably hit 30 Hz and still retain punch. That's deeper than most 12-inch subs in the same price range. It also features a rubber surround that helps keep the cone sealed at high excursion levels, which reduces the risk of the cone tearing during hard hits. For everyday driving, this means you can crank up the volume on a road trip playlist without worrying about the sub going wild or creating an unwanted rattling noise that would annoy your passengers. Another strength is the dual voice coil design. In practice, that flexibility lets you experiment with wiring configurations to fine-tune the power delivery. A lot of people who are new to car audio just buy a sub and hope the amp will just work. Having the option to roll the coils into a 1 ohm load can be a lifesaver if you later decide you need more headroom for bass-heavy tracks. It also means that if you ever upgrade to a bigger amp down the line, you won't have to replace the sub, you'll just rewire it. Now, onto the practical weaknesses. The biggest one is the size and weight. A 15-inch high excursion driver adds a noticeable amount of mass to the vehicle's rear end. In a small car, that can affect handling a bit, especially when you're cornering at highway speeds. It's not something you'll notice on a daily commute, but if you're a performance-oriented driver, it's worth acknowledging. The other downside is the heat dissipation requirement. The SA15 can generate a lot of heat under prolonged heavy use, so you need an enclosure that has proper ventilation or a heatsink setup. If you try to squeeze the sub into a tight, sealed box without any cooling path, you'll hear the amp start to breathe or the sub's output start to sag after a few minutes of continuous bass. Another hidden trade-off is the installation.